There are different groups of nuclei in the thalamus, and they were divided into three important groups, that is anterior, middle, and posterior. Anterior or preoptic, middle or tuberal, posterior or mammillary group. Again, these groups consist of several nuclei. Anterior group consists of preoptic nucleus, paraventricular nucleus, anterior nucleus, and suprachiasmatic nucleus, which have a different specific functions to serve. And middle group or tuberal group consists of dorsomedial, ventromedial, lateral nucleus, and arcuate or tuberal nucleus, whereas posterior group consists of posterior nucleus and mammillary bodies. This diagram shows the nuclei of the hypothalamus. These are anterior, middle, and posterior group of nuclei. You can see in the anterior, it is mainly the suprachiasmatic nucleus, paraventricular nucleus, and preoptic area, whereas in the middle group you have dorsal hypothalamic nuclei, dorsomedial nucleus, ventromedial nucleus, and arcuate nucleus, whereas in the posterior hypothalamus we have posterior hypothalamus and medial mammillary nucleus, lateral mammillary nucleus, and mammillary bodies. Connections of hypothalamus. The connections often usually comes from limbic system, that is mainly from the hippocampus and amygdala. They are concerned with emotion and behavior, whereas from cortex they come from frontal lobe, that is area 6 and prefrontal area, and then they enter directly from olfactory lobe and also para-olfactory area. There is afferent. They also receive collaterals from the lemniscal system and fibers from reticular activating system. And fibers of reticular activating system, they are associated with alertness. From the corpus stratum, it has a strong control over the tone and some involuntary movements. And hypothalamus also receives afferents from thalamus, from the brainstem, that is from raphe nucleus, locus coeruleus, and medulla. From hypothalamus, efferent goes to mainly the brainstem and spinal cord. The efferents pass via pontine nuclei and then through reticulospinal fibers. Descending impulses from hypothalamus terminate on lateral horn, controlling the spinal sympathetic centers. Hypothalamus thus control blood pressure, heart rate, diameter of the blood vessels. Fibers from supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei form hypothalamic hypophyseal path to end in posterior pituitary. They also send efferents to thalamus and the midbrain. So this diagram shows afferent and efferents to hypothalamus. Afferents usually come from olfactory, frontal lobe area, hippocampus, thalamus, amygdala, lemniscal system, reticular activating system, raphe nucleus, locus coeruleus, and efferents they mainly go to the spinal sympathetic centers, brainstem autonomic centers, posterior pituitary, and to the thalamus. Coming to the functions of hypothalamus, the important first function is regulation of the body temperature. The anterior portion of the hypothalamus, especially the preoptic area, is concerned with regulation of body temperature. An increase in temperature of the blood through this area increases the activity of temperature sensitive neuron, while a decrease in temperature decreases the activity. Anterior hypothalamus, it gives response to heat, whereas posterior hypothalamus responds to the cold temperature. Regulation of the activity in the anterior pituitary through the release of releasing and inhibiting hormones, trophic hormones, into the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. They regulate the functions of anterior pituitary. They also involved in regulation of posterior pituitary, that is the ADH and oxytocin, where ADH is synthesized from supraoptic nucleus and oxytocin from paraventricular nucleus. They also help in control of circadian rhythm, where that is the diurnal variation for many body functions, which is about 24 hours. For example, rhythm in the secretion of growth hormone, ACTH, melatonin, and gonadotropins, etc. The neural basis of circadian rhythm is lies in the suprachiasmatic nuclei. Uh, that is the main site for circadian rhythm, and these nuclei receive inputs mainly from the eye, that is via reticulohypothalamic fibers and the lateral geniculate nuclei. Control of sleep waking cycle. The basic rhythm is controlled by biological clock, the function of suprachiasmatic nucleus. Two sleep centers in the hypothalamus are recognized: diencephalic sleep zone and basal forebrain sleep zone. Diencephalic sleep zone is present in the posterior hypothalamus, interlaminar and anterior thalamic nuclei, whereas basal forebrain sleep zone, it includes preoptic area and diagonal band of Broca. Stimulation of these centers at 8 Hz induces a slow wave sleep. In the lesions of hypothalamus, narcolepsy is developed, that is disorder of sleep. It is important for control of autonomic nervous system. Hypothalamus is called as head ganglion of the autonomic nervous system. Its stimulation produces autonomic responses. Stimulation of anterior hypothalamus produces parasympathetic response like contraction of urinary bladder. Stimulation of the lateral areas of hypothalamus produces sympathetic response such as rise in the blood pressure, pupillary dilatation, and piloerection. Stimulation of dorsomedial nuclei and posterior hypothalamic areas produces increase in the adrenal medullary secretion, which is one of the physical changes associated with rage and fear. Then control of hunger and feeding. Two centers are connected with it, that is ventromedial nucleus acts as a satiety center, and its bilateral lesions causes hyperphagia, the hypothalamic obesity, and the lateral nucleus acts as a feeding center. Its lesion causes anorexia, that is loss of appetite, especially when prolonged, and animal dies of starvation. The mechanism is satiety center is primary center for control that controls the food intake, and it functions by inhibiting feeding center. Thus, VMN inhibit food intake and lateral nucleus stimulate the food intake. And you can see here the lateral nucleus, which is going to stimulate the food intake, but it is always under the influence of ventromedial nucleus, which acts as a satiety center. There are different theories for food intake. The cells of ventromedial nucleus acts as a glucoreceptors. This activity of satiety center is governed by the level of glucose utilization within the cell. An increase in blood glucose level increases the activity in VMN. A decrease in blood glucose level decreases the activity of ventromedial nucleus. Note that deficient glucose utilization in the cells of satiety area of hypothalamus is probable cause for hyperphagia in diabetes mellitus. This decreases its inhibitory effect on the feeding center, and thus food intake is increased. The role of hypothalamic peptides. The important hypothalamic peptides that seem to play an important role in the regulation of food intake are: the food intake is usually increased by neuropeptide Y, that is synthesized by the neurons of arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, and orexin A and orexin B, which are synthesized from the lateral hypothalamic neurons, they play important role. Ghrelin is secreted from the stomach and also as well as hypothalamus. The food intake is decreased by CRT, that is cocaine and amphetamine regulated transcript, and corticotropin releasing hormone. Then we have a lipostatic hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, the adipose tissue produces hormone leptin, the production of which is proportional to the amount of fat. It acts on the hypothalamus to decrease food intake. gut peptide hypothesis. Gut peptide hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, the presence of food in the GIT causes the release of gut peptides. These are glucagon, somatostatin, CCK, which acts on brain to cause satiety. Then you have a thermostatic hypothesis. According to this, the body temperature influences the food intake. Appetite is stimulated and food intake increases when the body temperature goes below a given set point and is inhibited when body temperature rises above the set point. So these are the different factors which are going to affect the food intake, that is cerebral cortex, lipid deposition, the limbic system, gastric stretch. Of course, they will be controlled by the hypothalamus by ventromedian nucleus and lateral nucleus, which are satiety center and feeding center. And also it mainly depends on the body temperature, personal factors like habit, preference, body weight, status of the subject, environment, and gut peptides like CCK, PZ, glucagon, somatostatin, and GRP. Then it has a role in the regulation of water balance. Hypothalamus regulate body water in two ways. One is creating a sensation of thirst and by controlling the excretion of water in the urine. Creation of sensation of thirst. Hypothalamus contains osmoreceptors which can detect changes in osmolality of the extracellular fluid. Thus, if there is a lack of water, the osmolarity of ECF rises, osmoreceptors of hypothalamus are stimulated, thirst develops, and drive for the water intake develops. A second hypothalamic mechanism is as follows. In conditions where the kidney produces renin, that is in case of hemorrhage or hypovolemia, renin converts the plasma angiotensin to angiotensin 2. Apart from its normal actions, angiotensin 2 also acts on the hypothalamus to develop the thirst, and that is going to develop the thirst behavior. Cardiovascular shock therefore is associated with thirst, and at this condition it is going to generate angiotensin in high quality, or rather quantity. By controlling excretion of water into the urine, the increased osmolarity stimulates osmoreceptors in the supraoptic nucleus. The estimated neurons of supraoptic nucleus in turn send impulses to posterior pituitary to release hormone ADH. The ADH is also secreted in response to angiotensin 2 when the fluid volume is low. The secretion of ADH increases water absorption from collecting ducts of the kidney. This diagram shows how the water intake is regulated. So whenever there is increase in the osmolarity, the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus stimulated that are going to produce thirst, and also they are going to increase the release of ADH from the posterior pituitary, which increases water intake and decreases the urine volume respectively, and hence osmolarity and blood volume they are restored. Similarly, whenever there is a hypovolemia, there will be volume receptors detect and the angiotensin mechanism is stimulated. At the same time, baroreceptors are also stimulated, which are going to increase ADH secretion. At the same time, they are going to increase the intake of the water by stimulating thirst mechanism, and hence osmolarity and blood volume both are restored. Apart from the hypothalamus, the regulation of water balance is also controlled by following mechanism, that is the buccal mucosal mechanism. If the mucous membrane of buccal cavity becomes dry, they develop thirst. Drying of the mouth and throat occurs during speaking, smoking, breathing through mouth, or by eating dry food. Then it can also be because of diarrhea, vomiting, and hemorrhage, which decreases ECF volume, which in turn reduces blood volume, and thereby baroreceptors stimulated, inducing thirst. There are also seat for emotional behavior. It is regulated by limbic cortex. There are two centers in hypothalamus which are involved in behavior and emotional changes. They are reward center that is located along the course of medial forebrain bundle, especially in the lateral and ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus. And there is also punishment center which is located in the medial hypothalamus and paraventricular zone. Then hypothalamus also controls sexual behavior controlled by the anterior ventral hypothalamus and the male piriform cortex.